In the summer of 1540, Thomas Cromwell's world was about to shatter. He'd been the most powerful man in England, second only to King Henry VIII. But power can be a dangerous game. Cromwell was a blacksmith's son who'd climbed to incredible heights. He'd become the Earl of Essex and the king's chief minister. Now he was about to learn a brutal lesson. Being close to the throne could be deadlier than being far away. His story is a chilling reminder of how quickly fortunes can change in the Tudor court. The man who'd brought down Cardinal Wolsey, broken from Rome and sent countless others to their deaths, was now facing the same merciless system he'd helped create. What made Cromwell's fall so terrifying wasn't just how fast it happened, but the calculated cruelty behind it. The king he'd served so loyally was now his executioner. Cromwell's rise had been anything but typical. Born in Putney around 1485, he'd fled England after a violent fight with his father. He traveled to Italy, learning ruthless political strategies and sophisticated financial tricks that would later serve him well. When he returned to England, he caught Cardinal Wolsey's eye. His sharp legal mind helped navigate Henry's complicated divorce from Catherine of Aragon. When Wolsey fell, Cromwell was smart. He distanced himself from his old master while becoming essential to the king. By 1532, he was Henry's principal secretary. He engineered the English Reformation, not from religious passion, but cold political calculation. He dismantled centuries of religious tradition, filling the royal treasury and solving the king's marriage problems. His methods were efficient, ruthless, and about to become his downfall. Cromwell built a network of spies across England, creating what some call the first modern intelligence service. He knew that information was power, and he used it ruthlessly. Anyone who stood against the king's religious policies risked being charged with treason, often based on carefully manufactured evidence. Between 1536 and 1541, Cromwell systematically dismantled monasteries that had existed for centuries. It was a military-like operation. Ancient religious houses were stripped of wealth, their lands given to Henry's supporters, and their inhabitants thrown out with barely a thought. By 1540, Cromwell had reached the peak of his power. He'd survived rebellions, navigated the king's complicated marriages, and built a fortune that rivaled the old nobility. But his success was his greatest weakness. Powerful enemies watched and waited. The traditional nobles, displaced by this commoner, knew Henry's favor could change in an instant. They were patient. They wanted revenge. Cromwell's ruthlessness had served him well in climbing to power, but it meant he could expect no mercy when things went wrong. The same legal tricks he'd used to destroy others would now be used against him. His downfall began with a single diplomatic mistake. In his eagerness to secure Henry's fourth marriage and build Protestant alliances, Cromwell had miscalculated badly. Henry's plan to secure a bride for the king seemed perfect on paper. But when he first saw Anne of Cleves, everything fell apart. The king was expecting a stunning woman from Holbein's portrait. Instead, he found someone he thought was painfully ordinary. Henry's brutal description of Anne as looking like a Flanders mare wasn't just a personal insult. It was a devastating blow to Cromwell's reputation. The marriage was supposed to strengthen ties with Protestant German princes, but Henry was already wavering, tempted by Catholic European powers offering more attractive deals. Cromwell was caught in a terrible trap. He had to find a way to end the marriage without destroying the delicate political balance he'd created. Every legal move was complicated by the very contract he'd so carefully negotiated. The more he tried to help, the more impossible his situation became. Conservative nobles led by the Duke of Norfolk saw their chance. They wanted to reverse Cromwell's reforms and reconnect with Catholic Europe. Henry's growing attraction to Catherine Howard, Norfolk's young niece, gave them the perfect weapon. The minister who once seemed untouchable was now standing in the king's way. Cromwell's world was crumbling. Fast. Cromwell was walking a razor's edge. He tried to manage the annulment of Anne of Cleves while holding on to his religious power. But his enemies were watching. They'd learned from the master himself. His downfall was swift. The political world of Henry's court was brutal and unpredictable. Within months, men who once bowed to him were now accusing him of heresy and treason. The very system he'd built was now turning against him. The Duke of Norfolk was plotting carefully. This wasn't just about royal anger. He needed a rock-solid legal case to destroy Cromwell. Norfolk knew how to push the king's buttons. He understood Henry's obsession with religious purity. By painting Cromwell as a secret radical who'd been manipulating royal policy, Norfolk could transform the king's mild irritation into pure rage. They started digging through Cromwell's letters to Protestant reformers across Europe. What once looked like smart diplomacy now seemed like dangerous conspiracy. Stephen Gardiner, the Winchester bishop, saw his chance. He'd always resented Cromwell's religious influence. Now was his moment to reassert the church's power. Cromwell's network of Protestant contacts, once seen as valuable, now looked like evidence of treachery. The trap was closing, slowly, methodically. Cromwell's scholarly reputation made it easy for his enemies to paint him as a heretic who went against the king's beliefs. The timing was perfect. Norfolk knew his niece Catherine Howard had Henry's ear, and this was the moment to strike. Catherine was young and beautiful, a total contrast to Anne of Cleves. Henry felt betrayed. Whispers started spreading through the court. Courtiers who once praised Cromwell now backed away, sensing danger. Cromwell was clueless. He thought he was untouchable. His confidence blinded him. He was too focused on the royal marriage mess to see the bigger threat brewing. Norfolk and his allies had been plotting carefully. They gathered evidence, lined up supporters, and waited for the perfect moment. Everything was set. On June 10, 1540, Cromwell attended the council meeting at Westminster. Nothing seemed unusual, just another day of discussing state business. But beneath the calm surface, a storm was about to break. Then, suddenly, Norfolk stood up. The trap was about to spring. The room fell silent as the charges were read out loud: treason, heresy, deliberate deception. Cromwell, the master of legal takedowns, now found himself on the receiving end of the same brutal tactics he'd perfected. Norfolk's voice cut through the tension, ordering the guards to arrest him immediately. It was a carefully choreographed humiliation. His garter insignia, that symbol of highest honor, Cibre, was ripped away. His staff of office snapped, his ceremonial sword removed. In moments, he transformed from powerful minister to common prisoner. The other counselors sat frozen, terrified to show even a hint of sympathy. One wrong move could implicate them in his supposed crimes. The chamber felt heavy, electric with the knowledge that England's second most powerful man had just been reduced to nothing. Chaining Cromwell wasn't just about restraint. In Tudor culture, it was a public statement of total disgrace. Norfolk made sure his fall would be complete and visible. News spread like wildfire through London. People who had watched Cromwell's rise with a mix of awe and resentment now gathered in streets, hungry to witness his spectacular downfall. His story was a brutal reminder. In this world, power could vanish in an instant. In the treacherous world of Henry's court, Cromwell's fall was brutal. He went from being the most powerful man in England to a broken shell of himself. Witnesses saw a transformed man, once confident, now confused and terrified. His destruction was methodical. The arrest was just the beginning of a calculated campaign to crush his spirit. The Tower of London, a place where he had sent countless others to their doom, now became his own prison. Poetic justice, perhaps. The conditions were intentionally harsh. No more fine clothes or rich meals. Instead, a cramped stone cell with barely any light or warmth. He wore rough prisoner's garments, a far cry from his previous luxurious attire. His interrogators were experts. using the very psychological techniques he himself had perfected. They knew mental pressure worked better than physical torture, and Cromwell understood this better than anyone. Each questioning session was a twisted reminder of his own past methods. They targeted two key areas: his religious beliefs and potential treason. Using his own extensive correspondence against him, they reframed diplomatic letters as evidence of betrayal. Former allies visited, adding to his isolation and psychological torment. Every moment was designed to break him. And slowly, it was working. The parade of former friends now treating him like a stranger crushed his spirit. Prison life was brutal. The poor food and constant stress destroyed his health. He withered before everyone's eyes. His interrogators were coldly professional. They knew exactly how to break him down. Sometimes they'd be aggressive. Other times, they'd pretend to be sympathetic. Their goal was simple: make him crack. The worst torture wasn't physical. It was the silence from King Henry VIII. No messages, no hope, no comfort. Just complete abandonment. The king he'd served loyally had turned his back entirely. Instead of a fair trial, his enemies used a bill of attainder, a sneaky legal trick to declare him guilty without evidence. They could destroy him without showing proof. The charges were broad and vague: religious heresy, alleged treasons, unspecified crimes. This wasn't justice. This was political execution. They wanted him gone, and they didn't care how they did it. Cromwell was accused of undermining the king's religious authority. These charges hit Henry hard, targeting his obsession with being seen as a true Christian defender. The treason claims were even more specific. They painted Cromwell as a traitor who corresponded with enemies and manipulated royal policy. The most cunning accusation centered on his role in arranging the marriage to Anne of Cleves. What had been a diplomatic mistake was now twisted into deliberate betrayal. Clever move. Parliament was a stage-managed spectacle. Cromwell's former supporters sat silent, terrified of sharing his fate. Anyone who dared speak up was quickly shut down. The bill raced through both houses with barely a whisper of debate. Everyone knew questioning it meant risking the king's wrath. This wasn't a real legal process. It was a formality, a predetermined execution disguised as legislation. The bill didn't just condemn Cromwell to death, it stripped everything: his property, his family's future, total destruction. For Cromwell, learning about the bill was devastating. The system he'd built to serve the king was now destroying him. The ultimate irony: the parliamentary machinery he'd crafted would be his own executioner. With ruthless precision, Cromwell's final days were a calculated game of survival. His enemies knew a condemned man might trade secrets for a glimmer of hope. Their primary demand? Annal Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. Imagine the bitter irony. Cromwell, the very architect of this marriage, now forced to dismantle his own diplomatic work. He was trapped, desperate, yet still expected to perform. His legal brilliance became a weapon turned against him. Every connection, every skill he'd cultivated was now weaponized to seal his own fate. He complied, hoping against hope that exceptional service might save him. The psychological toll was brutal. Visitors noted his transformation. Once a powerful administrator who struck fear into nobles, he was now a shell of a man: white hair, deeply lined face, pleading for mercy. As death approached, Cromwell turned to religion. Accused of heresy, he sought comfort from Protestant ministers. He wrestled with his earthly failures, desperately seeking divine understanding. His communications were ruthlessly monitored, every letter, every word scrutinized. In these final moments, he fought to maintain a shred of dignity, knowing each action might be his last. In his final days, Cromwell wrote heartbreaking letters to his son Gregory, knowing the boy would inherit the stain of his disgrace. Court officials buzzed about his execution, debating the method of death. Would it be the brutal hanging, drawing, and quartering reserved for traitors? or the more dignified beheading for nobility. Every detail would signal the king's final judgment. Henry's decision would reveal more than just Cromwell's fate. It would expose the monarch's own character. Cromwell clung to hope, a desperate, fragile hope that the king might spare him. His enemies knew this and played a cruel game, keeping him suspended between life and death. They understood that a man expecting mercy is easier to control. On July 28, 1540, Cromwell was led from his cell. The date was no accident. It was Henry's wedding day to Catherine Howard, a deliberate choice to ensure the king's joy wouldn't be interrupted by thoughts of his former minister's execution. Once a powerful nobleman, Cromwell now walked in chains. Crowds jeered. His journey from cell to scaffold was a final, humiliating performance. The mighty had fallen, and everyone was watching. The scaffold on Tower Hill stood ready, a public stage, a political statement, a warning to all who might challenge the king's power. Thomas Cromwell faced his final moments with a mix of dignity and despair. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke his last words. He was careful, so careful, not to criticize the king, yet still trying to maintain some shred of personal honor. The execution was swift, merciful even. A single blow from the executioner's axe ended his life, a far cry from the brutal death typically reserved for traitors. His head was then displayed on London Bridge, a stark warning to anyone who might challenge the crown. They buried him in an unmarked grave. No grand funeral, no ceremony, just erasure. News of his execution spread like wildfire across England and Europe. People whispered. Ambassadors wrote dispatches. Everyone understood the message. No one was truly safe in Henry's court. Just months earlier, Cromwell had been untouchable. Now, a severed head, scattered family, confiscated property. His name became synonymous with betrayal. It was a brutal demonstration of royal power, cold, efficient, absolute. The Tudor machine ground another potential threat into dust, leaving nothing behind but a chilling reminder of the king's absolute authority. Those who opposed Cromwell painted his downfall as divine punishment. They loved to highlight his lowly beginnings and supposed religious mistakes. His destruction, they claimed, was inevitable, a consequence of challenging established power. Protestant writers saw things differently. To them, Cromwell was a brave reformer, a martyr cut down by conservative enemies. They praised his administrative skills and his fight to free England from papal control. The charges against him, totally illegitimate. Foreign diplomats looked at the bigger picture. They were fascinated by how Cromwell's fall impacted international relations, especially the Protestant alliance he'd worked so hard to build. Continental observers were particularly intrigued by the methods used to destroy him. Modern historians are still wrestling with the truth. Cromwell's enemies were incredibly thorough in erasing evidence. Some argue he overstepped, pursuing policies against royal interests. Others believe he was simply murdered by political rivals. His religious beliefs remain a mystery. He definitely corresponded with Protestant reformers and pushed radical religious policies. But how deep were his personal theological commitments? Historians still can't agree. The truth remains tangled in centuries of competing narratives. Cromwell's religious policies were all about serving the king, not pushing any specific religious ideas. Historians have dug deep into why he fell from power. They've found it wasn't just one thing. It was a messy mix of political fights, personal grudges, and a royal court where your status could change in an instant. These scholars look at the bigger picture. They want to understand how power really worked back then. Was it justice or just pure political manipulation? Cromwell's case shows how blurry the lines could be between legal process and pure revenge. Just months after Cromwell's execution, Henry started to realize he'd made a massive mistake, but not because he felt bad. No, he understood he'd just gotten rid of the most capable administrator in his entire government, and now everything was falling apart. The chaos was immediate. Religious policies, foreign dealings, money management, all of it suffered. Henry discovered that Cromwell's systematic approach was something no one else could replicate. The nobles who'd plotted Cromwell's downfall were great at destroying him, but terrible at replacing his skills. In typical Henry fashion, he complained about false accusations without ever admitting his own role. Blaming others was his specialty, and destroying his most effective minister was the ultimate example of this. Thomas Cromwell's downfall had massive ripple effects. His death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It completely reshaped England's religious and political landscape. Without him, the king's religious policies became wildly unpredictable. The Protestant alliance Cromwell had carefully built crumbled instantly. German princes who once saw him as their key English contact now viewed Henry's policies as totally unreliable. England suddenly found itself diplomatically isolated and vulnerable. Historians have since reassessed Cromwell's legacy. Early accounts painted him as either a heroic reformer or a dangerous radical. Modern scholarship sees something more complex, a pragmatic administrator who made decisions based on practical needs, not pure ideology. His administrative methods were revolutionary. Cromwell used intelligence networks, propaganda, and systematic legal procedures that were centuries ahead of their time. He could coordinate complex policies across different government departments with an efficiency that was remarkable for his era. The brutality of his destruction was chilling. The same ruthless efficiency he used to build power was used to tear him down. It was a perfect, terrifying circle of political consequence. His story remains a stark reminder of how dangerous political life could be in early modern Europe. Thomas Cromwell's story still grips us today. It's a raw look at power and how quickly everything can fall apart. In Tudor England, being close to the king was like walking a razor's edge. One moment you're powerful, the next you're doomed. What makes Cromwell's downfall so chilling is how methodical it was. The very system he built became his executioner. His enemies knew his playbook because they'd watched him use it against others. They turned his own tactics against him with brutal precision. Imagine being the most powerful man in England, and then suddenly, nothing. Powerless, desperate, Cromwell spent his final weeks begging for mercy, trying to prove his worth. But the king's favor is a fickle thing. Was he a reformer, a ruthless administrator? Historians still argue. That's the beauty of his story. The ambiguity makes it compelling. His fate reveals a harsh truth. In a system ruled by one person's whim, nobody is truly safe. Cromwell's destruction shows how quickly legal procedures can crumble, how power can vanish in an instant. His story is a warning, today as much as it was then. Thomas Cromwell's story is a stark warning about power. When one person holds too much authority, danger lurks around every corner. His life shows how quickly fortunes can change. His administrative skills were remarkable. He built modern government systems that would outlast his own tragic end. Ironically, the very methods that made him powerful also led to his destruction. Henry VIII later regretted killing Cromwell, but that admission came far too late. The king realized he'd been manipulated by those who wanted Cromwell gone. His execution left a massive hole in the government, proof of how irreplaceable truly skilled servants can be. Cromwell's journey from a humble background to the pinnacle of power is both inspiring and terrifying. He proved that talent and determination can lift someone from obscurity. Yet his brutal downfall reminds us how fragile success can be. His story isn't just history. It's a timeless lesson about ambition, power, and the razor-thin line between triumph and total collapse. In the end, Cromwell became a symbol of how quickly political fortunes can turn and how dangerous absolute power can be.